Okay. Hi everyone. Um so today for book club, instead of reading a book, I just thought it would be cool to try something a little bit different. Try a paper. This paper is called Facing Up to the Problem of Consciousness by Chalmers, a very prominent figure in philosophy of mind or philosophy of cognitive science, dealing with things like physicalism, consciousness, awareness, all that type of stuff. Um, so, yeah, I'll just go ahead and start off talking a little bit, like a tiny bit of background, a little bit more generally about what consciousness is when we're talking about it in philosophy. Because it's one of these words that a lot of people will use, but a lot of people will mean totally different things. So, for example, if someone is asleep, some people might say, oh, they're unconscious. Some people might say animals are unconscious. Some people might say consciousness means remembering or like being aware of stuff. Others might say it's problem solving. It's just like it has a lot of dimensions and it's always used in very different ways. So one of the most important things when approaching these papers, and I think that Chalmers does a really good job of in this paper, is to kind of like define it and limit its scope so we can talk about it more effectively. But basically, consciousness, the way Chalmers is talking about it here, is something incredibly, or at least the consciousness he cares about, is the is something that's very very intimate, something nearly unexplainable, something incredibly subjective, not very measurable, or at least very very difficult to measurable. He's like speculating on. He notes that like this paper was written maybe 25 years ago, 30 years ago. So there's definitely been a lot of advancements in neuroscience, but even back then there was a lot of progress being done um, of scientists trying to figure out what it means for a mind to be conscious, to try and pick out little networks and pick out little patterns and the things going on behind the eyeballs when we say we're conscious in all of its forms. However, there's two sides to this discussion or to this problem of consciousness. There's what Chalmers calls the easy problems, or what people might call the soft problems of consciousness. These are problems that don't really concern him as much because he thinks, as well as most other philosophers in philosophy of mind, that these problems, they're perfectly answerable and perfectly understandable, perfectly explainable through through empirical observations. What Chalmers is most focused on, and what I think generally people are focused on when we're talking about the problem of consciousness, is this quote unquote hard problem of consciousness, the subjective side of consciousness. So, first off, let's get out of the way what these easy problems are. Um, just double checking. You guys can see my screen switching, right? I'm gonna hope so.
It,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, sweet.
Yes.
Yeah. So these easy problems of consciousness, they're like basic these are basic discrimination tasks or categorization tasks or control tasks that you can measure and observe in a lab. So it's things that you can, use eye trackers for and use brain imaging for, and then understand what's going on. So, for example, if you place someone in an experiment or in a room and you show them different types of fruits, they can recognize which one is the red apple, and then you can see which parts of the brains are lighting up. Then, as they do that, they can process this information of which one is the apple, and then they can go ahead and use their motor system to reach out and grab this apple. All of these things are perfectly observable, perfectly measurable. We can see what type of specific activations are going on in the motor cortex and in the visual cortex and so on. And it's just like a simple observational process of the visual stuff that we see, the recognizing or cognition going on, and then the motor response system. So these are all what Chalmers is calling the easy problems of consciousness. Um, it doesn't really investigate or get to the root of the problem or like the thing that's like really concerning philosophers. Basically, it's things that can be explained using methods in cognitive science or in neuroscience. What he's concerned with is the hard problem or hard problems. So we understand that there's a lot of processes going on in the mind, but the real kicker is, why do they feel a certain way? It's not that we're not wondering why we can see red. It's, why does seeing red have a feeling associated with it, a redness associated with it, a subjective experience. Oftentimes this will also be called qualia. That's how like a lot of people also understand it, and that's thanks to Jackson. But it's just like the trumpetness of the trumpet noise, the redness of red. These are the things, the subjective side of things that we can't measure in a lab. You can ask people to report on these conscious things, but we can't directly observe these subjective feelings. There's a gap. Hopefully you guys can see that there's this explanatory gap between the feelingness of something, the way something might feel, and then our direct empirical observations of that thing. So yeah, that's the hard problem. That's the one he wants to try and tackle here. And one of the common answers in philosophy of mind is to kind of go the functionalist route, to explain this qualia, this subjective experience through a functional explanation. So it's saying, like, it's looking at all the things going on in the mind and in the outside world and saying that there's a type of causal order that's going on with these things. That this will lead to that, and that will lead to something else. And then finally, you know, you saw this, there's an outputted behavior like grabbing the red apple. So it's understanding things in terms of like inputs. You get the wavelengths of red that smack your eyeballs, the retina, the cones in there, and then like the optic chiasm and the visual cortex and all of that stuff doing some like mental gymnastics, and then an output saying, I saw red. That's still not really like tackling the why it feels like red issue. It's only tackling the it's like a description of what's going on. So some really common objections to someone who would go the functionalist route and try and explain this experience, this subjective experience in terms of functional terms, is this philosophical zombie argument. And for those of you who aren't aware, in philosophy of mind, there's a very common thought experiment that you can do. And it's basically like, imagine there is a type of human out there, a type of zombie out there. Not like a Walking Dead zombie, half dead, half alive, but just like a human or someone that looks to be like completely human, but they're missing one key feature. They're missing that subjective experience. They're still perfectly able to take in inputs, to have internal processes, and to output certain behaviors. But what they're not able to do is to have the subjective feelings of redness or of a trumpet noise or of what it feels like to eat ice cream. But they can input all of that stuff, all of the different flavors on the tongue or sounds coming in your ear, process them, and then give an appropriate output. They're missing the feeling aspect of it. And that's what Chalmers is saying the functionalists oftentimes do. They're kind of missing the feely aspect of what it means to be conscious. He goes then into some really cool case studies, because in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of research in neuroscience coming out making claims that consciousness has been understood, we've solved it. But Chalmers is saying, well, no, not really. We've solved only the easy problems of consciousness. The hard problem is still, it's still fully unknown. Like, or at least we don't have a good solution for it. And later on, he proposes a solution. But one of the first case studies he kind of goes through is that these guys, these scientists, Crick and Koch, LOL, they made a pretty like bold claim. They said, oh, oscillations are basically what it means to be conscious. So they went ahead and measured people's brainwaves with EEG caps and said, okay, well, when people are conscious, their brainwaves are kind of they're synchronizing between 35 hertz and 75 hertz. And these gamma band oscillations, this is what is consciousness. So when there are these oscillations, it means that the person is conscious. Again, I feel like the mark is being missed a little bit, because here we're finding a correlation between people having a subjective feeling of consciousness and then a brain state that's going on. But it's not explaining how that how those brainwaves or how those oscillations are producing the experience, right? So it's like it's making that correlative explanation, but not like a purely explanatory, or how do I put it, like a purely causal explanation. So going this route doesn't really work for Chalmers because, why is it the case that these 35 hertz gamba bands produce conscious feeling and not 30 band or 30 hertz or 20 hertz bands of oscillations producing this conscious experience? There's an explanatory gap that's still going on with this one. And then another one he walks through in this paper is the Bars global workspace model. And this one basically posits that, okay, well, what consciousness is really is just basically when we absorb information and then that information becomes global. Global as in it's available to a wide or like a vast part of the brain or of the cortex. So it's not just like isolated to one little part of the brain. It's like being shared and transmitted around the entire cerebral cortex. And this one, it kind of falls a little bit short because um it's doing the same thing. It's like, why does this globalization of information lead to the feeling of redness as opposed to a localized accessing of information? So again, it's kind of making that jump in drawing correlations or making speculations and then not explaining why it's giving us that feeling. Because really it's the feeling of redness, the feeling of a sound that we're after when we're trying to talk about consciousness. You might also be familiar with the terms phenomenal consciousness or phenomenological consciousness. This is really what Chalmers is saying is the actual problem of consciousness. All other ones, they're just kind of like sidestepping the issue, talking about different things, but it's falling under the word consciousness, so it gets mixed up and like people start getting confused and they start talking past each other. Another thing that's going on here. Daniel Dennett, another titan that unfortunately passed away not too long ago, he had this proposal where consciousness, and I very much like this proposal. He thinks that consciousness is what he called a multiple draft. And what that means is that there's not like one unified conscious thing in our mind, the way Rene Descartes assumed that there was one soul or like one piece within us that's aware. He thought that it was a constant layering, scaffolding, and developing thing. So it's like things being revised over and over and over again, and it's that constant revision that leads to conscious experience, not just one piece of the brain in isolation. It's the constant and the active process of going over the information and then that information being interpreted in certain ways and so on. There's some issues that people bring up with that because, why would these drafts or why would these even refreshing frameworks or refreshing schemas give rise to the feeling? It's the same issue as before. It's kind of being only descriptive. It's not telling us why we're feeling what we're feeling when we see the color red or taste some ice cream. So then he proposes, okay, well, maybe we need this extra ingredient because as of now, we're just purely looking at physical things in the world and then drawing correlations to this subjective, feely aspect of consciousness. And then he proposes a lot of different dynamics. I mean, a lot of different candidates for this thing. Chaos dynamics, for instance, or non-algorithmic processing, quantum mechanics if you want to get crazy, new neural discoveries. But at the end of the day, he kind of goes point by point and says that all of these fall a little bit short. We need new fundamental principles that kind of introduce new laws into the way we understand consciousness. In the same way, there's new physical laws that have been discovered, like electromagnetism or like gravity. We need new laws that come into play to explain this subjective side of consciousness. So this is what he's proposing, basically saying, okay, we need one extra ingredient. This is what we should do. Let's take a non-reductive strategy. As of now, they've been all attempts to explain the hard problem of consciousness or to solve the hard problem of consciousness have been purely physical, right? So it's taking like physical states of affairs and then reducing them to try and explain something unknowing, like that we don't really know is physical. So what he's saying is, okay, what if we take consciousness or phenomenology or anything like that and take it as a fundamental property? So in the same way that before there used to be phenomenon that we didn't understand, like electromagnetism, we didn't really understand why it was acting on certain things in certain ways and leading to outcomes in experiments. The same thing can be applied or thought of when it comes to consciousness. Maybe there's this other type of fundamental property we're not aware of, like the law of gravity or like unknown quantum laws, that's giving rise to this feeling of red when we're looking at a red apple, or the taste of vanilla when we're eating ice cream. And he kind of calls this naturalistic dualism. So he's not saying exactly that. It's a little bit unclear here whether or not he's saying that this new fundamental property of consciousness or experience is something that is physical, or if it's something non-physical. But what he is going as far as saying is that it's something that we're not reducing to the physical. So it might very well be physical, but we're not reducing it only to that. It's like leaving the door open a little bit. Maybe there's these other fundamental laws in nature that allow for conscious experience. You know, something that this candle doesn't have, but my brain does have, maybe. So this is what he's proposing. Maybe there's that. So, if we were to understand it through these terms of adding a new law to the way we understand the world, we could possibly answer questions like which certain types of physical systems give rise to experience. So is it like if we just have a certain coordination of or a certain like structure of neurons, is that what makes it conscious? Or maybe it's a certain artificial neural network that if you tinker it in a specific physical configuration, then it has the property of experience. Which type of informational structures can give rise to phenomenal qualities? Maybe some that all animals share or some animals share. And then if this is the case, if there are certain types of structures that give rise to phenomenal experience and phenomenal structure or this phenomenal aspect to living, then perhaps we can start to predict how people would feel. And so, again, these are not physical laws or not purely physical laws, maybe something closer to emergent laws or, I don't know, non-derivable laws. You know, like in the same way you can't derive gravity from electromagnetism or, any type of other physical laws, you can't derive consciousness from classical physics or from biology or things like that. So then he brings in this next piece of the pie to explain or to kind of like build on his theory, that of structural coherence. And structural coherence is saying, okay, well, when we have conscious experiences, there's two sides to this thing, to this non-reducible law that he wants to propose. There's an experience structure of the thing, and then there is the awareness structure of the thing. And so in cognitive science and philosophy of mind, there's a big issue between differentiating what it means to be aware of something and then what it means to be conscious of something. These things are always a little bit different, and depending on who you ask, they'll define them in different ways. For example, you might not currently be aware of the temperature in the room that you're in right now, or thinking about your birthday. Those things, they're not at your current awareness, but they're within your consciousness. They're like accessible. So here what he's saying is that, okay, when we have phenomenal experiences, things like, let's take a color, for instance. There is the experience structure, so what it feels like to see the color, and then on the other side of that, there's the ability to discriminate between a redness and a blueness. So like a cognitive science aspect to it. Two sides of the same coin. He's saying that they're always mirroring each other, but they're not, but they don't imply each other, right? They're just two sides of the same coin, I guess. Indirect explanation of qualia. I'm not sure if I totally understand it or understand what he's trying to say here, but The way he puts it is that wherever there's a structural pattern in subjective experience, then there must be some sort of corresponding structural pattern um, in functional awareness or functional experience. So as long as the brain is configured and firing in a certain way, then you will have that phenomenal experience, or that thing will have a phenomenal experience of that color or of whatever you're experiencing. Then he gets onto another mouthful of a term, organizational invariance. Here, basically, he's kind of like repeating himself a tiny bit. He's saying that causal organization, so the way something is structured, is going to lead to the same experience. So if in some way, shape, or form I was able to, like, atom by atom replicate my brain when it's perceiving something that's red, that little building of a brain will have the same feeling of red, even if it has no arms or no legs or anything like that. It's just that the structure of something is what leads to the experience of that thing. The feelingness comes from the organizational structure of the thing. And he brings up this argument to kind of push this forward. And he's saying, okay, well, what about dancing qualia, which is kind of fun. And he proposes this thought experiment, more or less, this dancing qualia thought experiment. So it's like, basically, imagine you have a person, right? And then you're fully, completely measuring their mental state. Each neuron, you know how they're firing, you know what they're connected to, you know everything about their physical properties, their locations, and all that type of stuff. And let's say that we go into the person's brain, and then we gradually replace each neuron with a functionally identical silicon chip, or like little like artificial chip. Something that performs the same actions as a neuron, but isn't a wet biological piece of meat. And it's like an artificial piece of an artificial little chip. Each chip has the same causal role in this brain than the neuron it replaces, but it's a different thing. So he's saying, okay, well, what can happen if we were to create this? Case A, so either if consciousness is purely dependent on biology, on the meat construct of our brain, then at some point the person's experience should change. If you move around enough neurons and insert enough silicon chips, then at one point their red will no longer be, the feeling of red will no longer be the feeling of red, it'll be the feeling of something slightly different. The feeling of blue or the feeling of purple or whatever. However, if the system is functionally identical, as you're swapping in and out all of these little chips, then it must behave the same way. So if it's acting in the same way, but there's no change in the way you're experiencing things, how does that work? How do we explain that? How could you experience different things, but the mind itself is it's the function of the mind and all of its properties are identical? Reductio ad absurdum, he says. This shouldn't be possible. He doesn't think this is plausible for us to swap out little chips in our brain and then to have different experiences. Case B, the one where we accept this type of organizational invariance. Here, he's a little more sympathetic to this. He says, okay, well, maybe, so long as any two systems, they have the same organization, the same structure, then they both have identical conscious experiences. So you can basically copy and paste my brain and we'll have identical conscious experiences. There is no dancing qualia, as he calls it. So like there's no immediate changing from perceiving red to perceiving blue just because you swapped one neuron out with a silicon chip. You preserve the phenomenology of experience. He brings up this double aspect theory of information, which was already kind of talked about, but I guess just it was kind of, it's akin to structural coherence, let's say. But this double aspect theory is the idea that all information has two sides to it. All information has physical properties and then phenomenal properties. So again, these phenomenal properties are these novel properties that are different than physical ones, but maybe they're existing on top of the physical, but they're not the physical substrate of themselves. They're a different type of physical thing, or they're a different type of property that's maybe playing on the physical or interacting with the physical, but that's unclear. thinks that if we have information that has these dual aspects, then consciousness must arise from this, or consciousness is a property of information. And so if we're saying that consciousness is a property of information, then this starts to feel a little bit unifying but radical at the same time. Because then you get close into panpsychism, or into everything is conscious, everything is aware to some extent, which I don't know if I fully am on board with it, but yeah, that's where it kind of starts to move. It starts to move in that direction. If all information has two aspects, this has the aspect of being a phone in a case, and of being hard and weighing a pound or whatever, and it also has phenomenal aspects, and it's kind of like saying that in a way that the phone is conscious, and that's panpsychism. Basically, it's saying that everything is conscious to some level. um yeah, and that's kind of as far as it goes. So basically, small rundown or small recap this of this paper was that the hard problem is he proposes a solution but doesn't push it too forward too aggressively, and then it's real and unresolved. All reductive theories, the ones in cognitive science, they're not answering the actual hard problem, they're answering the easy problems of consciousness. And then there's some hope for the thing that he proposes. Maybe one day we'll be able to figure out the theory of consciousness. And then if you guys want, there's some other papers to read, and I'll like post this little slide for stuff after. But that's all I have. I'll go ahead and end that.
To share more reading material, please.
Pardon me?
Yeah, I mean, for me at least, yes, please.
Mm-hmm.
Chris, what was this from? Was this from a book or an essay or?
This was a paper by Chalmers called Facing Consciousness. I think it's one of the first slides. It was Facing Consciousness, Facing Up to the Problem of Consciousness by David Chalmers.
I think you could put in the chat. I really love cognitive science, so this is right up my alley.
Yeah, no, I think I linked it in the currently reading. If you scroll up a tiny
Currently
bit.
reading? Okay.
Yeah, and then I'll
Yeah,
put
you
put my
the PDF, right?
Yeah, it's a PDF.
Yep.
It's relatively short. I think it's like 20 pages, more or less. 25 pages, but like very easy to read. No technical jargon. That's why I like Chalmers so much, because he just like talks incredibly simply. I don't understand half of the papers in cognitive science, but he does them all justice, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this addressed a lot of the concerns that I usually have when I talk to people about this. It's like that's not the hard problem of consciousness. Those are the easier problems.
Yeah, it's like you're
Those are the
sidestepping
more
it.
solvable ones.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it feels like most people just sidestep the question. So I appreciate what this guy's trying to do.
Yeah, but it's kind of bold to introduce. I mean, not saying that like it's impossible, but it's bold to introduce new fundamental laws of nature. But maybe.
Bit bold. That's what we're here for, though, right?
I guess so.
I had a question regarding one of the slides.
Sure.
I think I remember what was on it off the top of my head. I don't know. You can verify it from the slide, though. I think you said something like, you can't derive like electromagnetism from gravity, or you can't derive gravity from electromagnetism, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And my worry is that sure, you can't do that, but that's not like you derive both from physical things, right?
Yeah.
Its physical properties give rise to both the laws of like the law of gravity and the laws of electromagnetism. And so, I guess the question would be is, because I've always understood Chalmers as putting forward some kind of property to that there's fundamentally two like that the fundamental ontic structure of reality is going to be both phenomenological and physical.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't go quite forward as to go for like full on like substance dualism, like positing souls, like Mike Humer goes in for like more substance dualism type stuff.
Yeah, no, that's a good point because it's hard for me to say, and it also depends like where in his career you're reading the papers, because sometimes he seems a lot more sympathetic to substance dualism, sometimes he's a lot more
Right.
apprehensive. Um, I think like he's closer to like non-reductive physicalism. I would say that that's where he's like on the spectrum of fully substance dualist to completely reductive physicalism. He's like somewhere here. So he's saying
Yeah.
that maybe there's like emergent properties of physical things, of like the laws of nature, that supervene, and then in that way it's almost as if it's a new property. But I guess the analogy between like not being able to derive gravity from magnetism, it's more so that um it's more so that neither of them can explain why the other one is the way it is. Like, we don't know why the speed of light is what it is. We don't know why magnetism has the constants it has, but we know that both of them fit into the physical framework, of how we understand physics. So maybe he's hinting at like there's another type of law, the law of consciousness or the law of phenomenology, that could also fit into the physical, like universe, or like the stuff we understand in physics as of now.
Right. I think he usually uses the term psychophysical laws, right?
Yeah.
And we have physical laws that govern like the way physical stuff behave, and then we have psychophysical laws that govern the way
Hmm.
phenomenal states behave.
Yeah, so it's weird to say, or yeah, I don't know. Does anyone else want to chime in?
I have a question real quick. What does emergent mean in this context?
Emergent would be like imagine, I always use the example of like baking a cake, right? It's like you mix eggs and then milk and then flour. Those are all the elementary parts of it. But then once you put it in the oven and it comes out, now it's a little bit of egg, a little bit of flour, a little bit of sugar, whatever. But it's also something else. It's something new. It's like it's a cake. It like gained something almost. So in the same way that like a complex system of neurons can be just a complex system of neurons, something that emerges from that like it gains something almost, would be consciousness or phenomenal experience. At least that's how I understand
Okay,
emergent. Yeah.
perfect. Thank you.
A more technical definition that I think is important is that like typically if something is truly emergent, you'd want to say that it has some kind of property or like usually like causal influence that is not reducible to its. So like consciousness has all of these seeming qualitative properties that you can't reduce to the underlying physical parts, and
There
that's a
is
very
this
important thing because if you could just purely reduce it, then it in some sense like doesn't really exist.
yeah, there is this term, kind of the idea of gestalt, the idea of like the collective whole, or the kind of embodiment of a set of things being greater than the collective set, like a sum of its elements. So
Yeah.
kind of anything added on would be like an emergent property of the set or the collective.
Okay, I
Yeah.
think,
Well
yeah,
put.
I think I get it.
Emergence is like one of the least understood concepts in all of philosophy of mind, because no two philosophers agree on what it means.
Yeah.
I also think it would have to do with degrees of complexity. Because, for instance, chemistry is emergent from physics and biology is emergent from chemistry, but you wouldn't dare explain biology in terms of physics because it's so complex to try to explain it from so small rules that you just focus on discovering the new emergent properties and to describe biology to describe biological systems instead of trying to get them from physical small laws. So
So
I think it also has to do with a very large gap in complexity.
I don't know if I necessarily buy into that, because I believe that we could describe any given set of biological or like chemical properties or rules as a like complex set of physical or like physics bound laws. I don't believe that there's some emergent property there where you couldn't ultimately, if you were to like bloat or complicate your model enough or go deep enough into it, you couldn't explain any given subset of chemistry or biology.
Yeah, I don't think it's a hard wall. I think it's rather a more practical that emergence is more a soft wall than a hard wall. And in any scenario, I don't really see emergence being a hard wall in any case whatsoever.
I mean,
I don't know what you think.
here's an example of like I don't like actually consciousness is like the prime example of that, right? So if we take a non-materialist stance, if we take this idea that there can be some idea of like some qualia, some fundamental like internal experience, there seems to be no way to there might be possibly, but it doesn't seem like we intuitively are able to derive some set of physical reasons or even biological reasons for which those qualia are experienced the certain way that they are. So like redness doesn't need to be a certain way. It doesn't even need to be a feeling of redness. It could simply be like a neurochemical signal. But the fact that we have this experience, that seems to be the emergent property that's coming about.
It's like another one, I guess I just typed it in there, but it's like you have all of the ingredients for making a cake laid out in front of you. So it's the exact same physical components of what a cake is, but you can't ever point at where the cake is. Like, no, that's the milk, that's the sugar. Only until everything comes together does it gain the property of cake. It's like properties, like through the more complex a system gets, the more properties it gains or it can gain. Just like same thing with consciousness. That's how I understand emergence. But again, there's also a term in philosophy of my mind called like supervenience. And supervenience physicalism is a super popular one. It's like very similar to emergence. It's like imagine, I think the common like thought experiment is like imagine you have a type of pointillist painting. So like those paintings where it's just a bunch of dots and then once you zoom out, you see the whole picture. So like all of it's completely the same whether or not you zoom in or zoom out. Like no dots have been added to this picture or pixels on a screen. But it's almost like you gain something when you look at it as a whole versus looking at it in one tiny like area. Same way like if you had a microscope and you looked in at the cake, you would see a molecule of like milk or a molecule of like flour. But once you zoom out and kind of understand it, it gains this like cakeness. And that's what consciousness is when we're talking about qualia. It seems like something emerges, something comes up over and above just the raw components. What's scary about this though is that like I kind of wanted to hear your guys' thoughts on whether or not consciousness needs a biological substrate to exist on. So does it need like meat and like brain tissue to be a thing, or can AI be conscious basically?
I mean, we can speculate about that, but I don't believe like there could be a real like exhaustive reason why it can't be the case. Like you
There,
can't disprove the case. I don't believe.
Let's do a vote.
I
Yes or
think
no?
you will be familiar with I'm sorry, what?
No, I was just saying let's do a vote, but I want to hear you instead.
So that I know this is kind of famous notion that you can get a Terminator scenario without AI actually being conscious. It just needs to seem to be conscious. And that's enough. And to us, it would seem like it was conscious, and it doesn't matter whether it actually is conscious or not. It will still kill us.
Well, let me ask you
And I
something.
know.
Can you prove that like I get that's like a practical approach. It's like whether like once something seems like it's conscious, then we can deem it conscious. But that's kind of the case with every other human. Like the only consciousness you can prove is your own, in a way.
I guess that's true.
The philosophical zombie, yeah,
So
like in some of the slides, the philosophical zombie. We could all be philosophical zombies except for you, Emorph. Just terrifying.
I mean, I've heard this idea now. It's an interesting one. It's this idea that even when we view our own consciousness, it's not necessarily that we can know of it, it's that we simply cannot doubt it, right? Because to do so would be to doubt your own reason or ability to make decisions or have thoughts. So it would be almost akin to saying, like, the only thing I know is that I know nothing, right? It's not a tenable position, but there's no reason that it can't be like a fact abstracted from the perspective of the mind. It could be that you aren't conscious or that it's some illusory thing, but you yourself cannot be the one to doubt that, like the nature of it being so.
Yeah, very Cartesian.
So the idea is you might be fake and you don't know it?
Maybe. I mean, I just don't think you could doubt your own consciousness. I don't know if you can like know it as like a fact of the matter without knowing what you're looking for concretely so.
Well, I feel like you can, like,
I think
sorry, go for it.
I think we are conscious by definition because we are adjusting the term consciousness to talk about ourselves. And if we discover something along the way, we'll adjust the definition of consciousness to still be talking about ourselves.
Why would we be doing that?
Because otherwise, what are we talking about?
Well, if we're talking about consciousness as this so like above and beyond experience that describes non-physical states, so things like qualia, you could derive some explanation of that same thing that doesn't require humans to necessarily fit into that characteristic or group.
Yeah, so I think that's the point that Chalmers is making, and I guess most other people in philosophy of mind, it's like when we say consciousness, really what we mean is phenomenal consciousness or like the qualia consciousness. That's what we're talking about, and like that's how we clarify it. It's the over and above of the over and above property that is not the physical, the emergent thing. Because I feel like you can't doubt that you're feeling red. It's like you either feel something or you don't feel it. You feel the impression of red or you don't feel it. Even if it's illusory, it's still a sensation you're having. So there still is a type of phenomenal experience going on.
Right. But you can't prove it necessarily. You can simply just not doubt it. I don't know if those are one and the same.
Well,
Something that's undoubtable is not necessarily proven.
It depends on the epistemology in which you're working with. Descartes, the epistemology in which Descartes was working, those are different. And so, like, Descartes' like argument doesn't prove consciousness. It just shows that you can't like doubt your own consciousness.
Right.
But you could have an epistemology where like not being able to doubt and
being true are the same. Yeah.
You could have like a non-intuitionist epistemology where it's like true just not true implies false, right?
Yeah, like it can be like Descartes couldn't prove, or I mean he goes on to do that, but I think what you're getting at is true in the sense of it being like true, like we're awake and we're aware and like this is the real world. Maybe not true as in like maybe we're dreaming or hallucinating type thing. Because if we're talking about that stuff, then it's hard, very very hard to prove that it's true that we're having these phenomenal experiences. But the only phenomenal experiences only goes as far as saying we're feeling something, not saying we're feeling something in a dream or in the real world or hallucinating or so on. So I get what you're saying there though. We cannot prove that we're not dreaming or anything like that.
I think that the AI question is like on one hand, I think it's really interesting, and on the other hand, I think it's actually completely trivial. And the way in which it's completely trivial is I think that ultimately you can't prove or disprove the fact that something else is conscious. And so the sense that it's trivial is just your answer to whether or not biology is required for consciousness is going to just come down as a result of your theory of consciousness. So like if I'm like just throw out two theories, people aren't familiar with them, it doesn't matter, but like if you take like a kind of Schopenhauerian like analytic idealism, like the kind of defended by Bernardo Kastrup, it's just going to come out that like nothing non-biological could be conscious, because what it is to be conscious is it is to be, or what consciousness looks like is metabolism and biology. And so in that kind of theory, you're just not gonna, it's just gonna pop out of the theory that nothing non-biological could be conscious. But that's not a definitive proof of that. That's just a thing you have to accept as a result of your broader theory of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah. If we're, I guess if you boil it down to like the experience of qualia or non-material experience, then I guess the question does kind of change in its nature. It's interesting that you voted no on that, Carson. I would wonder why. Like, are you taking a firm stance either which way on what consciousness is to be?
And I'm the only one who voted yes. Interesting.
I am.
So this is largely, my answer of no is largely coming from the side of which question is interesting, in the sense of when you say conscious AI, do you mean artificially created consciousness, or do you mean the kind of AI that we have now? The kind of AI that we now have now, I'm definitively of the belief that it will not ever be conscious.
Just
But I'm not against the idea that
That such a thing could exist.
that we could create like artificial consciousness.
Okay. Yeah, there you go. So I think, yeah, my question was kind of like, is it possible for there to be consciousness that's not biological or not existing on like a biological substrate? So basically like conscious AI. Maybe in the future. As of now, I'm totally on your side. I do not think it has the phenomenal experience that we have. But that could
The
just
current
be a matter
AI
of
definitely doesn't.
yeah.
Yeah.
That would
There's
imply
no reason that it has to, like, unless it's like part of your base definition of what it is to be conscious for it to be biological. I don't know if there's like a true proof against the idea that it could be the case that a non biological thing could be conscious.
I have a question. If we're able to create conscious AI, prove that materialists are right, everyone else is wrong.
We would
Pardon?
prove that consciousness is like it's structural, not necessarily biological. I think that's what we would go as far as saying, or at least that there's these phenomenal laws that can exist on networks or systems that are not biological. I don't know if it would disprove dualism, because there still could be other properties that are just non-phenomenal that beings have.
I think it would probably largely disprove naturalistic substance dualism of the kind that like Mike Humer defends. I think it would be incredibly strange to posit that like there's a point at which a like technology becomes advanced enough that a soul enters it just as it enters a biological body. That's gonna get like really weird. I think you probably could maybe argue that like a theistic understanding, like God could just like decide to put a soul into like an AI or like a robot, but that would depend on like your theology.
Yeah, but that's kind of my question. That's kind of the spirit of my question. Like, do you have to deny the spiritual world and the existence of a soul in order to think of a conscious AI?
I would say no. I would say a spiritual self or like a soul type of thing, especially in a theistic context or just like a spiritual one. isn't the same thing as phenomenal consciousness. Or especially like I don't know many religious people that would equate them. That would equate feeling the color red as being spiritually weighty, like having spiritual oomph. I would think they're different.
I do know that oh, I'm gonna blank on his name. He's one of, if not the leading neuroscientist on the planet.
What does he do?
He's just like, he's probably the most like well-known neuroscience researcher on the planet. He's like,
Is it him, by chance?
nope.
No. Or Baron Cohen, the professor at, what was it, Oxford? Or
Are you
No, he's
thinking
a
of
young
Damasio?
No, he's a young
Oh, he's
guy.
young. Okay.
He's like contemporary. He's like probably the most current, like he's very contemporary. I mean,
David
that's a
Eagleman?
very subjective judgment.
Wait, are you thinking of David Eagleman?
No.
Because he had a talk with Peterson about something similar.
It'll take a sec to find the name, but he
Got it.
he's pretty strong a proponent that consciousness is tied to biology, which is, I think, is interesting coming from like a neuroscience perspective, not like a philosophy perspective.
I have another question for when we have a second.
Anil Seth, that's his Dr. Anil Seth.
Oh, okay.
I'm just reading Icarus's comment back here. I'll read it out loud to you guys. I have an interesting new approach. I think consciousness, not just to be an intrinsic quality distributed across particles or entity, but rather something that emerges in and through relational structure. Not unlike the way meaning emerges in language. So akin to the emergence of meaning in language. Instead of viewing consciousness as a substance or essence present in all matter to varying degrees, I propose we think of it as structural grammar, a kind of metaphysical syntax that describes itself through the way things relate, signify, and co-articulate to one another. This shifts from what is consciousness to how does the world articulate itself into experience. I'm not sure what you mean by articulates itself into experience. In language, no word has meaning in its own. It's the network of difference, syntax, recursive rules, semantic potential that gives rise to significance. Similarly, maybe consciousness is not housed within any particular object, but enacted in the ongoing dance of relational differentiation. This is sounding really close to like supervenience or emergence. It's like it's not the thing itself, it's like a property that the thing gains. Much like how
Sounds like
subjectivity...
idealism.
Yeah. Interesting though, yeah. What was your question? I think someone had a question. I'm curious. Was it you, Arshia, that had the question?
No, I don't believe so. Though I am curious why Icarus would say simultaneously that it's not bound to a substance or essence, but would still be against the idea of there potentially being a conscious AI. I am curious to that.
Did you mean to say like that consciousness requires a physical thing for it to come about? Or is it an independent thing? I'm also a bit confused about that. Don't know. Ooh, some people voted for yes, conscious AI. Interesting.
That's me. Not ChatGPT, mind you, but definitely if you swapped each neuron one at a time for silicon chips, I mean, it's the same causal process. Why not?
Yeah, like in that dancing qualia thought experiment. seems perfectly fine to think that if we're just swapping out neurons for silicon chips one at a time, once we've swapped all and each one has the exact same function as all the neurons, then you'd still be conscious at the end of the day and still have the phenomenal experiences that you currently have. But maybe some people would disagree.
Chris, are you familiar with the conscious nation of China objection to like functionalism?
No.
Um,
Enlighten me.
this is another famous. I'm trying to think of who. I think it might be Searle.
Mm.
So this is like objections against like kind of Lewisian style analytic functionalism, where it's that, let's say you took like the nation of China, the historical example, just because I guess there's a lot of people, but just like kind of just broaden it and say just like take an arbitrarily large amount of people and lay them out in some like superstructure where each person is part of a giant network that carries out the functional roles of a brain. And from that, should we conclude under functionalism that the entire like group of people produces a conscious state, like a singular unified conscious state?
Yeah, I think that is Searle.
Yeah, I think that might be Searle, because Searle has two. Searle has like the Chinese room experiment,
Yeah.
which is different. The nation
Interesting.
of China one.
I don't have a good answer to that, but if it is the case, that we can that people can just like get together and then create a bigger consciousness, then it means that companies are conscious, that schools are conscious, that teams are conscious, that just like any big group of people who all have their own roles and come together to like achieve something greater is to some level conscious.
Well, I think specifically it would be that like you'd actually have to structure it, and so that like you're actually playing the roles of like what the brain is doing, right?
Yeah.
You wouldn't just be it wouldn't be like a more like panpsychist idea of like, oh well, like if you just combine all the conscious parts you get like a more conscious thing. Like that would be like
just
a kind
like
of panpsychist objection,
giving each person the responsibility of a neuron, basically.
Yeah, basically like you just turn each person into a neuron and then have like this giant structure of neuronal firings, but being played out as like people passing information from one to the other.
So about or phenomenal consciousness, this like feely aspect of it. I asked this question, but I didn't get a satisfying answer. But it was basically like most of you guys would agree that people have phenomenal consciousness, or an ability to feel what red is. Now, would you guys say that other more intelligent animals, like I don't know, chimps or dolphins or pigs, do they also have this phenomenal quality?
I think.
Or phenomenal capacity?
Yeah, probably. Seems like we have. It seems like we have as good a reason besides one very obvious reason. It seems like we have pretty good all the reasons we have to believe that other people are conscious. We have all those same reasons, besides like one very particular one. That we have reasons to believe other people are conscious. The only thing that we have for other people that we don't have for animals is that we're of the same kind of structure as other people, so we can make the inductive leap from saying like, oh, I'm conscious, so it's probably the case that other people are conscious. But we also like make that inference based on like, if you kick a person, they react in pain. Well, you can do that with a dog, and they'll do the same thing. People be like, they behave when they're hungry in certain ways. Well, animals do that, right? There's all these different behaviors that we.
Yeah, but to what end can you reduce that down? That we have very similar traits to perhaps a dog or a chimpanzee, but how about a single-celled organism? How about an amoeba, right? At what point does it emerge out or dance out this idea of subjective experience? And what's the bar?
That's basically where I was going at. Yeah. It's like, cool, we can more like the line of reasoning I go through is like, yes, dogs, they definitely have a phenomenal capacity. So do dolphins. So do all other similarly structured vertebrates. Go down on like the scale of intelligence or of similarity from human to other animal. And then where do we say like, no longer does that have a phenomenal experience? Because we wouldn't say a bacteria has a phenomenal experience. Probably not a blade of grass. Probably not a flower. An insect would probably not. And then a rodent, it's like, okay, yeah, probably they do. But where does phenomenal consciousness emerge? Basically, at what level? And if it's present in all of them, but just to varying degrees. So like if I can have this impression of red, but a dog will have that same impression of red just like at a lower level or like a quieted level, then doesn't that go to like wouldn't the right inference to be that like lower formed organisms are just feeling red in like lower ways but not no ways? And in that way saying that like every panpsychism basically, everything that's alive has a phenomenal experience, at least to some extent. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I agree. And I wanted to ask about DNA, because when you talked about societies and companies and all that, I have thought about DNA sometimes as it being a semi-conscious entity being, because it's the same in all beings and it behaves the same way in all beings, and it looks for the most efficient ways to I don't know, to perpetuate each is, I don't know. I think it's an interesting thing
Yeah, to continue
to think
itself.
about.
Yeah, maybe DNA
I
is
mean,
the necessary let's say like attribute to emergence or to consciousness or whatever. Could be it.
but does it have a conscious or some sort of consciousness?
Say that again?
Does DNA have a sort of consciousness?
If we're going down the panpsychist route, I would have to say that anything that we'd consider alive, so like self-replicating, would have a very, very low degree, but not zero, a degree of consciousness. In other words, everything that's alive is conscious. Panpsychism. I would think so, but I don't know. I'm flirting with panpsychism, I guess. I don't know if I'm on board, though.
Carson,
Shoot.
do you believe like a ground functionalism kind of view would be an interesting rebuttal to panpsychism in this context?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. That's what I'm thinking through right now. Is that
Yeah.
line that arises on a sort of ground functionalism?
So let me try and formalize it. Kind of, there might be some necessary bar or condition or some mind making process that exists somewhere, wherein there is a minimum degree of complexity required to have the experience that we have. There could still be a bar by which it can't be atomized, and that bar might be emergent from a certain physical state. So there's no reason to believe that it must be continuous or atomizable down to the degree of everything, even that a chair has a conscious experience.
You said physical state. What about functional state?
Yeah, functional state could also be
Okay.
could be one way. Yeah.
I don't know, these questions are beyond me. They're tricky.
I don't think ground functionalism in and of itself can answer a question.
No,
like,
of course
is
not. But
bacteria conscious? It's just an explanation of it's a materialistic understanding of how consciousness arises.
I mean, even ground functionalism doesn't posit what the actual processes are. I'm just saying, like, it posits an alternate view to one in which there's an infinitely subdivisible view of consciousness that can reduced down to panpsychism.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there would definitely be some kind of line.
I know this might be a little bit tangential, but like this same idea of consciousness and like requiring a physical substrate for it to exist on. There's like really interesting thinking about octopi or octopuses, because of how different they are anatomically than us. And I think that's like who is it that talks about it? Dennett. I think it's called multiple realizability. So maybe it can be that like varying pieces of physical stuff can have these properties of like pain and consciousness or whatever. And we don't even need to like get too sci-fi with it. We can just look at octopi and how they are apparently very conscious, or as conscious we can say as like dogs or something like that. But biologically, their brains, there's no correspondence to the way their brains work as to how ours work, because most of their brains is just like, I guess, throughout the body. Most of their neurons are throughout their body. Don't know where I was going with that, but tangential.
Yeah. Oh wait, it's a nice thought. It's a nice thought because I wanted to mention that maybe you have to be a mammal to be in that superior category. Because if you think about it, only mammals have maternal instincts, and only mammals, or mostly mammals have need to care for the weak ones and for the old ones. But I think it all comes down with it all falls down with the octopi argument.
Yeah, because I remember, like, I think 30 or 40 years ago, the like ethical guidelines for scientific research, they would classify like vertebrates in a different ethical category than invertebrates. So you could perform experiments on worms that you couldn't do on mammals or vertebrates. But after a lot of findings with octopi and how they can like remember faces and solve complex problems, and they play and they do all this like stuff that seems like to be pretty intelligent, they were deemed, I think, by New Zealand like honorary vertebrates under their like ethical guidelines. So you can't do the same type of experience you can do in other invertebrates than octopi. But yeah, it's
I
like,
have a really interesting. Even if we buy into
Honorary
the
vertebrate.
even if we buy into the idea that that like even if we buy into the idea that life has to be in some way, or consciousness needs to be in some way carbon based, which seems like a really really weird thing to state. It's really interesting when you look into it that carbon can actually by itself act as a semiconductor, and so technically speaking, there is no real material difference between a carbon based chip that could have some sort of underlying process going on, or some sort of signal based web, similar to like a neural net that the brain has. So even if you look at it from like a purely like chemical or just elemental view, the same thing chemically that humans are made of, just arranged differently, more akin to how we would consider a computer to work, could itself produce some sort of AI. And would you
yeah,
wager that that can't be conscious?
like, yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, Giancarlo, but I think it's like the carbon atom has like 4 free electrons that can pair, and that's why it can like bind nicely with a lot of other organic chemicals. Silicon has 2 free ones, so some like people, some like scientists think that if there's life, it's very possible that it's like silicon based life, like alien life, as opposed to carbon based, if there's just no carbon in on those planets, but there is silicon.
Carbon is a far more abundant element throughout the
Yeah.
universe, though. So
Mm-hmm.
we would probably want to guess that, like, if there
More
were
likely.
alternative forms of life, yeah, carbon. I mean, the fact that carbon does have 4 free chemical bonds to be had is actually like a pro for the idea of life, right? It can form way more complex organic structures in the way that we see. Technically, those same structures could exist in silicon, but then you'd need like not only an abundance of silicon, but also potassium and boron and all this other stuff, because you need holes and you need excess electrons and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But cool thought. Like it's there's no clear reason for why it necessarily must be carbon. It's just practice.
No, even the other way around. Like that's what I was saying. It's the other way around. Not only is it not needed to be carbon, it's also not necessarily that carbon is for life. Carbon could also be used to make computers. So if carbon's used for computers instead of silicon, which we currently use, would that be any different?
Yeah, no.
Like, it could, but carbon's also way more resistive than silicon. So, like, good luck.
Yeah,
Good luck
it's way.
Good luck running a 4mm TSMC process on a carbon die.
No, of course not. You couldn't. But like, if you had a large enough scale, again, it's not about the degree of
Well, like the
real world
practicality,
feasibility. It's the
possibility.
conceivable feasibility, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's in principle, not in practice.
Yeah, it's principle.
Okay, I gotta go now because I got some lab work to do, but it was great chatting with you guys. Hopefully you can come back for
boy.
the next book club or next paper, whatever it ends up being. But yeah,
Do
I
these
gotta
happen
go.
every week?
Pardon?
These happen every Sunday?
Yeah, every Sunday at this time. And then there's also
Right.
another one that Cade is running later tonight at 10 p.m., I believe, on Kierkegaard's Sickness Unto Death. Or, yeah,
Oh,
Sickness
good.
Unto Death.
Cool.
If you want to do that stuff.
Okay.
Okay, sweet. Peace out, guys. Great talking.
Take care. Later.
Take care.